Okay, so hi to everybody. I'm delighted to have the invitation today to participate in Cork Discovers and to talk about one of my favourite topics, which is the magic of milk. And I'm a professor in UCC. I've been studying milk and the products we make from milk for nearly 30 years now, and I still find it a really interesting and exciting topic. And I'm going to hopefully, over the course of the next few minutes, show you a little bit of why I think milk is a very exciting material to work with, and why I think, although we see in Ireland, we're very familiar with dairy products being all around us and in our homes and in our fridges, why sometimes we take it for granted and how there's much more to milk than meets the eye. And we're going to see some examples of how we have, for a very long time, been able to make dairy products like cheese and the other products we can see in this slide here, and try and get, over the course of this short talk, a bit of an insight into the science, the unseen science that lies behind these everyday products. So we're going to talk about the magic of milk. And one of the reasons why I say milk is magical is if we think about it, it's the only thing which is produced, which is intended to be eaten. It's produced specifically for the purpose of consumption. Everything else we eat today, we have decided to eat, whether it be plants or whether it be animals. It can depend on our diet and our preferences. Milk is the thing that nature has made for us to consume. So it's perfect nutritionally. It's got rich in all the things our bodies needs. It's rich in proteins, it's rich in fats and sugars and important vitamins and minerals, right? And that's why we've consumed it. We've consumed milk for thousands of years. The archaeologists have found evidence of people back tens of thousands of years BC consuming milk and dairy products, finding vessels with evidence of milk being used, even finding cups from prehistoric times that were clearly used to feed milk to babies. So we've been consuming milk for a very long time. It's nutritionally rich, and in an Irish context, it's one of our greatest natural resources, in that we pride ourselves as being a milk producing country. We drive around our countryside and we see cows out in fields eating grass, and they're producing milk. And the Irish dairy industry that makes products from this milk is one of the most successful in the world. But the thing about milk, and one of the reasons it's a complicated material to work with, is it's unstable, it's perishable, it's changeable. All the things that make it desirable for humans to consume, all the nutritional riches, also makes it, if you like, a bit of a magnet for bacteria to come in and grow it. So to make it into a state where it can be consumed by humans, where it's safe to be consumed, where it has it's stable for a little while, so we can transport it from place to place, whereas raw milk, as we know, will go off very quickly. All these require us to do things which we call processing to the milk. And different solutions to this problem. We're going to see things like yogurt and cheese and butter even are really ancient solutions to the problem of how do we preserve the goodness of milk. Okay, and one of the really cool things from a scientific perspective is what I have at the end here, what we talk about the paradox, that a lot of these things were an art long before they were science. So we were making butter in Ireland for thousands of years. It was very common in kitchens all over Ireland, probably up until the middle of the last century. The people would have a churn and make their own butter from their own cows or from a neighbour's milk or whatever it might be. Archaeologists and farmers regularly dig up samples of what's called bog butter buried around the country that are thousands of years old. For some reason, maybe to protect it from raiders or to preserve it, it was being stored in bogs. So we've known how to make dairy products for a very long time. It's been an art and part of our culture and part of the culture of countries all around the world. And it's only in recent decades we've really figured out why it works. We know how to make butter, but why do we make butter in that way? Why do we make cheese in that way? And these are the kind of things I'd like to talk about today in this session. So milk, it's a fragile treasure. That we get it from the cow when it's still warm, when it's rich, it's full of nutrients. But if we leave it to stand, a couple of things happen. One, it physically separates into cream, floats to the surface of the milk. I remember when I grew up in Dublin in the 1970s, we used to get our milk delivered in glass bottles to our doorstep, which would be very unfamiliar to people today in Ireland. But we used to get milk and it was unhomogenized. So we would see the cream layer at the top. And I remember it used to be like a race to get the milk in before the magpies or other birds who would know that there was something really rich and nice to eat in those bottles would come in and try and pick holes in the little foil lid and get it to cream inside. So it separates into cream and milk, but at the same time, more worryingly and more seriously, bacteria start to grow and we get spoilage. So we've invented over a very long time, as I said, different strategies to prevent this from happening. And we call these processing. And this is what I've been studying for my whole research career. And one of the really fascinating things about milk is, and one of the kind of themes of what I'm going to talk about today is the milk, to me, it's like a box of Lego blocks. And there are different kinds of blocks. And if we assemble the blocks in one way, we make a product like cheese. If we assemble them in another way, we make butter. If we assemble them in a third way, we make yogurt. So milk is literally one of the really fascinating things about it. It's a liquid, it's a fluid, but it's a fluid that likes to make solid dairy products. And how we convert this liquid to a solid has been one of my main areas of study and what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, and the equivalent of our Lego block is then how do we take milk and convert it into the whole range of products, in this case, the whole range of cheeses, for example. How do we take one single raw material like milk and manage to get all these different types of material out of it, okay? And so to understand why that happens and how that happens, we have to kind of think about what's in milk and realize that there's more to milk than meets the eye. If we look at milk in a glass, it looks white, it looks bright, it looks clear, and we might think intuitively there must be something in there that's making milk white. But if we look at it, not with our eyes, but with a microscope, we see in this schematic diagram, we see there are two kinds of particles in there. One is very large particles that are floating around. They're quite light, which is why they rise to the surface, and these are globules or droplets of fat. And on a smaller scale, we have at a smaller size, we have small kind of balls of protein, and the protein in milk is called casein, or the main protein. And these protein particles, which we'll talk about in a minute, are what are called casein micelles. And what's really interesting is that these are what gives milk its whiteness. That milk is actually not white. There's nothing in milk that gives it a white color. That the white color that we get is literally just a trick of the light. Because there are certain particles which are of a certain size, and the particles in milk, the fat globules and the casein micelles to be talked about, are of just the right size range, where when light passes through the milk, they reflect it and they make it look white. Just as there are particles in the air that reflect light coming from the sun and make the sky look blue, then there are particles in the milk which affect the way in which light passes through the milk and make it look white. And you could ask a question of, is there another example of this in real life? And there is a very easy example, an example we could say maybe we see a little bit too much of in Ireland, which is something else where you have very small particles which are affecting the passage of light and making something look white. And what this example is clouds. Clouds look white because they're big collections of water droplets, and the water droplets are of the right size that they interfere with the passage of light through it. They cause the light to kind of bounce off in every direction, and they make the clouds look white. So clouds aren't white, it's water droplets affecting the light. And it's exactly the same in milk. So we could say that milk, if we wanted to, we could say milk is a cloud in a glass, because it's exactly the same principle that makes clouds white is the principle that makes milk white. And I think that's a kind of a nice way to look at it, because if we think about it, what do clouds make? Clouds make rain. Rain makes grass grow. Who eats the grass? The cows do. And what do the cows make? Milk. So if you like, there's a little bit of a cycle there from cloud to milk, and it's the same principles. So it's only the particles present that make the milk look white. And in milk, from which contains lots of fat, it's both the fat and the protein to do it. But if we remove the fat, if we go sometimes to the shop and we buy what's called skim milk, from which fat has been removed, we can see that the milk is still white because the protein alone will do it. And that's why in this video here, I'm just going to show a little bit to explain how this works. Because what we're going to do is we're going to show how easy it is to remove the protein from milk. And we're going to actually look at what the protein looks like. And ideally, we'd be doing this as a real life demonstration, but obviously we're online. So here's a little video I prepared, and a number that I've prepared recently with the help of a colleague in UCC called Dave Waldron. I'd like to thank for his help with this. And what we've done here so far is I've just taken a little bit of acid in the small bottle, and I've added it to a bottle of skim milk. Okay, and I've calculated the amount of acid that brings the acidity to a very specific level. And what's happened here is you can see the milk, which started off being very clear and milky, has now turned lumpy. And that's because the milk proteins are very easy to destabilize. And if we bring the acidity to just the right level, and we measure the level of acidity in a material by something called pH, and in this case, we might remember that pH 7 is a neutral pH, and pH below it are acidic. Milk usually starts off at a pH around 7 or a little bit below. And if we bring the pH down to about 4.6, the protein coagulates. And you'll see here that what's happened is we have made the protein coagulate, and we've now in our strainer got the protein out. What you're looking at in that strainer at the top of our image is raw protein, very simply extracted from the milk just by adding acid. So that is what you're looking at, is actually the milk protein called casein. Okay, and if we do this very slowly, if we bring the pH down very slowly by fermentation, what we'll see is that instead of getting a kind of a solid material, we get a kind of a gel, and that's how we make yogurt. We use bacteria to grow in the milk and convert sugars naturally present in the milk into acid, and this gives us yogurt. The other thing I want to comment on in that video is after removing the protein from the milk, what came through the sieve into the jug, you could see it had a kind of a greenish color, and it was watery, it was clear because we've removed the protein. So an interesting question is, if milk is white because of the presence of the protein in the fat, and it's a trick of the light, what's the real color of milk? And I guess you could answer that by saying the real color of milk, and this might come as a surprise, is actually a very pale green. Because when we remove the light effect, what's left behind is pale green. And that's due to actually the presence of a vitamin called riboflavin, which gives us that greenish color. Okay, going back to the slides. Let's talk about another example of how we make products. Let's focus on the fat. Oil and water, we know it's a kind of a cliche that oil and water don't mix, but milk is an emulsion. We said that there are droplets of fat which are present in the milk, and if we leave raw milk stand, the fat separates, which is why I said when I was growing up, I used to get glass bottles of milk with a cream layer at the top. Today, to prevent that from happening, we do what's called homogenization. We break up the fat globules into very small particles, which don't separate during storage, and we don't see this cream layer anymore. So we talk about milk being an emulsion, which is basically what we call something which is a mixture of oil and water, which although oil and water don't mix, they are somehow stable. So it means there has to be something present that is keeping the oil and water apart. And we see it on the left-hand side of the slide. We see these little droplets of the yellow oil are coated in a little red layer. And this is what we call an emulsifier, which is like a barrier that keeps the oil and water apart and keeps the globules from all just coalescing together and separating from the water. Okay, so the fat in milk is present as these globules, and which can be broken by brute force in a little air, which is what we do when we churn milk into butter, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. Because we look here on the left-hand side, this is a very powerful microscope picture of fat in milk. And we can see it's a little droplet. And what you're seeing on the outside is this membrane. And the fat is all on the inside of it. So to get the fat out and make a product like butter, we need to break the membrane. So if we take in this schematic, this little droplet, in this case, we've colored the membrane blue. What we're going to do is we're going to break the membrane. And we break, the membrane's actually quite fragile. And to break it isn't very sophisticated or clever operation. It just requires a lot of energy. Even shaking cream or whipping cream, particularly in the presence of air, as we'll see, because when we agitate or when we damage the fat globules and knock holes, literally knock holes in this protective membrane, what happens is it exposes the fat. Fat doesn't like the water. And when two globules that are damaged kind of come close together, to minimize their contact with the water, which they don't like, remember, because oil and water don't mix, they stick together in clumps. And if we also have air present in this diagram, the big blue bubble here is literally an air bubble. That's also something that's free of water. So what happens is air being present in the system helps the fat to destabilize. It sticks to the surface of the air bubbles, and eventually it builds up and up, and the air bubbles eventually burst, and we've got lumps of fat that are produced from all the damaged fat that we've produced by our mechanical action. And this is what we then collect. We separate it from the liquid around it, which is what we call buttermilk, and we see here we get a block of butter. So again, we're going to look at a video on this in a second, but it's an example of how something that's been done by the Egyptians and the Greeks, and on the right-hand side here, being done in Ireland and buried in bogs for whatever reason, is now become a well understood scientific phenomenon. So here's a little video where we're going to show what happens when we make butter, where we're shaking cream in a jar. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play again another minute or two of a video here, where we're going to start off with just cream, which is bought from the shop, which is, as you can see, just regular, unhomogenized, the type we might buy coming up to Christmas for making into desserts, etc. And we're going to pour it into this jar. And one of the important things is that there's plenty of space left in the jar, and the rest of the space is obviously filled with air. So it's really important when we do this to have lots of air present. And then we take it and we shake it. Now, this requires a lot of shaking, and we could be watching this for quite a while. So we're going to speed it up, and we're going to speed through to, so there's a bit of time lapse going on there. And what we see, first of all, is that the cream solidifies. It is now turned into a kind of a solid material, which has got a much larger volume. So what we've done here is we've taken the air bubbles, we've taken air, distributed it into cream as bubbles, and coated those with fat. And this is what we call whipping. So we might decide to take that whipped cream and put it on an apple tart, put on a piece of plum pudding or cake, or use it as a dessert. Okay, so that's whipped cream, but now we're going much further. We're taking the whipped cream and we're continuing to shake it. We're shaking it so much we're bursting the bubbles at this point. So the whipped cream is like all the bubbles surrounded by fat. And now what's happened is we can see that the fat has started to extract. And one of the things that's very easy to see, to know how this is working, by the way, is that fat is yellow. Cream isn't yellow, milk isn't yellow, but the fat is, and we can see it. And that's particularly the case in Ireland because of a compound called carotene that the cows get from the grass makes the fat yellow. So we know when it's working when we can see a yellow color appear. So all I'm doing at this point is draining off the buttermilk. And we could use that. We could use that as a drink. Some people use it, make it into, use it in baking, etc. So we're just draining off the buttermilk and leaving behind the lumps of fat. Okay, so then we're going to put the lid on again. This is quite a labor-intensive process, as you can see, and we're going to keep shaking. So what we're doing now is we're taking these lumps of fat and we're kind of kneading them together and pushing them and forcing them together. And we're going to keep shaking. And again, this goes on for quite a while. So we're going to do a little time lapse skip now in a second. And we're going to see what it looks like. And we're going to see as time goes on, that the structure of the butter grains breaks down. And we start to get a much smoother, more even looking kind of a butter product. And we can start to see something which is starting to look like butter. Still got that kind of graininess to it. But this is clearly, so you can see that making butter is actually very simple. All it needs is time, energy, a suitable container, and a bit of cream. And we just keep, and you can see a bit more buttermilk coming out. And then we'll just skip forward to the end now in a second. We pour off the rest of the buttermilk, and we can take our cream and we can pour it out onto, we can take our butter, and we should see at this point that it's something that's recognizably. So we're just doing a little bit more shaking here to remove a bit more of the buttermilk and to firm up the rest of the butter. And again, by the time we're finished this step, we can see something that's clearly looks like a lump of butter. Okay, so there's our butter. So it's just showing how easy it is, and we can pour it out and we can see our lump of butter that's present in our jar. Oh, it's a little reluctant to come out. So we just pour off a bit of the buttermilk, and we're going to extract, give ourselves a little bit of help with a spoon, and you can see something that's clearly like butter, and you can even see a kind of a degree of the kind of texture of butter and the spreadability of butter. So butter is a really easy product to make, and that's why it's been made in kitchens around Ireland for a very, very long time. We can see it spreading here. Okay, let's move on. So the final thing I want to talk about is, so we've talked about how butter how the fat makes butter. We've shown how the protein can be removed very easily just by making milk more acidic. We've seen that if we do that slowly, we can make a product like yogurt. But what I want to talk about is another property of this protein called casein, which is that it's made of protein. The protein is a chain of amino acids, which is folded into complex kind of shapes, like a necklace of different amino acids linked together into a complex shape. And in milk, the casein particles, these little round protein particles, are made up of thousands of molecules of these proteins called caseins. There are actually 4 of them, and one of them is called kappa casein. And it's described, the kappa casein it has a kind of a stabilizing effect on the casein micelle. We find it on the outside of the micelle. And it's often described, by the way, if you can picture the micelle as being like a ball, I always picture if you had it in your hand, it would be like a hairy, kind of woolly ball, kind of squishy. And on the outside of it, it's got a kind of a rough, hairy surface because it is protein called kappa casein. And the thing that keeps the micelles apart, that keeps the protein floating around in the milk and not precipitating or not falling out of solution, is the properties of kappa casein. And if we neutralize the properties of this protein, we do things to the milk. One of the ways we neutralize it, literally, is by changing the pH, which you saw earlier when you make acid. But another way is to add an enzyme called rennet. And what this does is it literally, if we talk about the kappa casein being like a hairy layer, it gives the protein a haircut. And it chops off the hairs and it makes the protein unstable. And again, going back to our Lego analogy, the protein after treatment with this rennet forms three-dimensional structures that we call cheese. And if we look at it under a microscope, and this is a really amazing picture, this intricate kind of lace-like structure is our three-dimensional network of destabilized protein. And this has been done for a long time. In a book from thousands of years ago called The Odyssey, they talk about a group of Greek sailors who are traveling on a voyage of exploration. They come to an island where there's a cyclops, a one-eyed giant. And the cyclops, actually, it says in this 1,000-year-old book that he was making cheese, and he was using sheep. He had a herd of sheep and he was making cheese from the sheep, and he was storing the milk in bags made out of the skin of sheep. And this is where this enzyme called rennet comes from. And that's how he was making his cheese. So we've known and recorded in ancient Greek mythology how to make cheese. Today, we use bacteria and we use other methods to make the make the enzyme, to provide the enzyme we use for cheese making. But back for a very long time, it was used, animal extracts were used because animal stomachs in particular are rich in this coagulating enzyme, because it's part of how we digest milk and milk products. So we've been able to make it. Here's some images from medieval times and even back to Egyptian times of making cheese. And today we make it obviously in a whole range of scales, from very large cheese factories to small farmhouse cheese factories around the country. And we can see here a little video extract of what happens. And the casein, what we can see here, this is sped up after the enzyme is added to the milk. And what you've just seen happen very quickly is at the start, you've got these protein kind of particles, the micelles, just floating around very fast, randomly, but under the influence of the enzyme. Usually it takes about half an hour to work, but obviously it's sped up here to a couple of seconds. You can see the protein has lined up into very neat three-dimensional solid structures. So at this point, let's watch our third and final video, and then we're going to finish up in pretty close to after that. And we're going to see what happens when we add this enzyme called rennet to the milk, okay? So again, what we're going to start off with is it works well at about temperature of about 32 degrees. That's the optimum for milk to coagulate or rennet. So I've got a little jar, in this case of rennet, and I'm pouring it into the milk. And I'm using this thermos flask to keep the temperature nice and warm. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the rennet. I'm going to give it a bit of a shake to mix it in. Very quick, kind of gentle shake just to distribute the rennet through it. And then I'm going to leave it sit for about a little more than half an hour. And when we open the lid at this point, we'll see that the milk is solidified. And there's a little bit of liquid, whey has started to ooze out of the milk. So all we've done, this is just skim milk once again. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a mini version of what we do in a cheese factory. We're going to cut this gel into small pieces. You can see I've got little wire cutters, and we're just cutting it first of all vertically. And then the second step, we're going to cut it horizontally to kind of give us little cubes or little chunks of this gel structure. You can see some of them sticking to the wires as we pull it out. Okay, so we're just going to shake that. Yeah, a little bit of it's escaping, but you can see the lumps of curd there on the table and stuck to the sides of the thing. Give it a little bit of a shake, and we can see the mixture of curds and whey. So we can see the curd particles floating in this way. And usually in real cheese making, what we'd be doing then is we'd be stirring it, we'd be maybe cooking it up to try and help to force out more and more whey. But here, just for the purposes of simplicity, we're just pouring it into our sieve, which is lined with a little bit of cheesecloth. And we'll see that over time, and again, we can see the pale green whey, because this is just skim milk, so we've removed all of our protein, and again, we get this watery green whey coming out the far side. And what we see is our little kind of collection of curds. And again, this looks a bit like what we did with the acid earlier, but there's no acid added here. It's purely the action of this extract enzyme called it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and do a very small scale making cheese. We've just got a little plastic mold here, which has got small holes in it. And you can see that we're going to take the curd that's coagulated from the milk, and we're going to pour it into the mold. Okay, and then to help squeeze out, we're just putting this kind of heavy rubber bung in it, like a little bit of a weight. And you can see it's pressing down on the cheese curds, and it's squeezing out the whey through the holes in this little mold. And when we leave that for a few minutes, we can see we've got a little miniature cheese. And that's it, and it's got quite a nice, squeezy, firm texture. So that in literally less than an hour from adding the enzyme to the milk, most of the time it was just sitting there, we've produced cheese. So we take our milk, we add rennet, we typically add bacteria called starter. We cut the curd when it gels with knives and separate into curds and whey. We do things which we didn't show in the video, like stirring and heating to firm up the curds and squeeze out more whey. We typically add salt, and this gives us our curd, which we then is the starting point for our cheese. Because we might get excited, we might think at that point, okay, we've made cheese. And if we tasted it, what would it taste like? It'd be rubbery, it would be bland, and probably the only thing that we would taste is salt. So making the cheese is actually the first step, and it takes months to produce what we call a ripened cheese that we're going to find suitable for eating. So what happens is, over the course of weeks or months or even years after making the cheese, lots of different biological variations are going to take place, depending on what cultures we've added, on what conditions we ripen it in, on what type of milk, whether it's goat's milk or sheep's milk or cow's milk, is going to end up with lots of different types, whether it be cheddar or a blue cheese or a creamy camembert type cheese or a brie type cheese. And tiny little differences in how we make it, in the cultures that we add, and the enzymes that we add, and the ripening conditions. Here's an example on the lower right of cheese ripening, believe it or not, in caves in a cheese plant in Spain, which is common for some traditional types of cheese. So tiny little variations result in different types of cheese. Because what happens is, during this ripening period, all the cheese becomes an absolute maze and complex system of biology and chemistry. And it takes things like the proteins. If the top diagram here is the idea of the chain of amino acids, and the cheese is full of enzymes. Some that came in from the rennet that we added, but also from the cultures that we add and from the milk itself. And over the months of ripening, these act like scissors, and they chop up, for example, the proteins to give us small chains of proteins and amino acids, which are what gives us the flavor and the texture. The changes in how the proteins are structured give us the change in texture to give us a soft cheese or a hard cheese or whatever it might be. And then the other breakdown products are the ones that generate the flavor. And in parallel, the fats and the sugars will also break down to give us a cheese flavor. And tiny differences from one variety to another are why we end up with all the different types of cheese, just like here. Okay, and in contrast, if we do it with using acidity, going back to our start, the fact that acid can transform milk into a gel, we can see here again, very sped up, what happens if bacteria are growing in our milk. Again, our protein has been flying around kind of randomly, but over time, as the acidity develops, it lines up into these beautiful, delicate three-dimensional structures. And that's what causes yogurt. So we go back to the very start of our talk, and we come back to the idea that milk is like a box of Lego. And if we assemble the Lego in one way, we make cheese. If we assemble it in another way, we make yogurt. We assemble it in a third way, we make butter. And hopefully over the course of the last few minutes, we've got a sense of how easy it is to do those things on the one hand, and on the other hand, how much complex and hopefully interesting for everyone who's listening science is involved in that transformation. So it's ancient. It's been practiced in kitchens, farmhouses, particularly in Ireland, for a very long time. And the science has followed the art, and hopefully the understanding has not diminished the wonder of these changes. I think milk is an amazing material because it's so simple and so complex at the same time. And in Ireland, it's today the basis of a hugely successful economic sector. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for the Cork Discovers for the opportunity to talk today. And if anybody's interested to learn a little bit more about these things, I wrote a book which was published last year called Molecules, Microbes and Meals, which talks about lots of aspects of food, not just dairy products and milk, in the way in which hopefully I've talked about it today. So it's designed for non-scientists who'd like to learn a little bit more about the food that we encounter every day in our lives. So thank you once again.